Good afternoon and welcome to today's ISA seminar on the subject of WTO Reborn, a South Asian perspective. Today's seminar will be delivered by Mr. Pradeep Mehta, and Mr. Pradeep Mehta is very well known to most of the trade, competition and regulatory sort of students and specialists and experts connected to South Asia and also many other parts of the world. But for those of you who may not have had the opportunity of hearing more about him and his organization, Mr. Mehta heads an organization known as the CUTS. It's kind of gathered a large reputation by its abbreviation, CUTS. And its full expanded form is the Consumer Unity and Trust Society, CUTS International. CUTS has been in existence for a very, very long time. In fact, apart from other things, I think Mr. Mehta needs to be noted for having floated an organization like CUTS way back in the 1980s, which was a very remarkable development in the field and space of civil society organizations in India. And we normally think of civil society organizations as being active primarily in the field of human development and social development space. But I think CUTS is a very unique example of an organization which is focused on the consumer. And today, of course, there's a lot of conversation that goes on around what benefits the consumers, how should the consumers' interests be looked after. But I can assure you this wasn't anywhere like what it is today, 30 years ago when CUTS was established. And the wonderful part is that today CUTS has around a dozen offices all across the world. I mean, it's very firmly placed in Geneva. It has offices in Africa, in Southeast Asia. CUTS has a fairly active running presence out of Vietnam and Hanoi. And of course in places like Nairobi, Lusaka, Agra, and a number of other places across the world. And there are two major agendas of CUTS, if I can focus this that way. In fact, the Pradeep had proposed two possible themes on which he could speak on once he was here. One was competition reforms in India. So that's one element, a very pronounced element of the CUTS agenda and work program. But the other, and here this is where I came in with, I suppose, my own personal bias. I wanted to sort of get Pradeep on to speak on WTO. And WTO and trade policy issues are something with which he has been very, very actively involved. And his interest and CUTS's activity are not limited to WTO only, but they step well beyond that into areas of trade in South Asia, trade in the region, and a number of connectivity activities which are going on in the region, of which we often discuss among ourselves, subjects like the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal agreement, and so on and so forth. So today we are very glad to have Pradeep here. He's transiting through Singapore, and like most transit visitors whom we catch, we have caught Pradeep as well to come and have an audience with us. And Pradeep is going to speak on WTO Reborn and give a South Asian perspective on this. Then I think just to add one point before I request Pradeep to take on, is that I think there's a sudden interest in the subject of WTO, what WTO can do, how it can become more effective down the line in the world of trade and trade organizations. Is after what happened to the TPP. I think post TPP there's a hope. I mean, it could be optimism, it could be wishful thinking, it could be a substantive hope as well in the fact that WTO can come back and rejuvenate the world trade agenda in terms of engineering the multilateral trade framework, which has been in place for more than 2 decades now. Nobody better than Pradeep to talk about this from the perspective of South Asia, because I think he has been at it from a South Asian agenda perspective for a very long time, trying to get the South Asian interest the South Asian thoughts, views, and approaches to WTO and see to what extent they can fit in with the larger multilateral trade framework and connected agenda. And of course, in this context, he has done an enormous amount of work on the least developed countries, the developing countries, and he's also pretty much aware of the politics that goes on around it, the entire political economy of multilateral trade negotiations and how they fit. So, Pradeep, without further ado, I am very, very happy to welcome you on behalf of ISAS and my colleagues. I must convey to you the apologies of our director, Professor Mitra. He went for a health checkup in the morning and hasn't been feeling too well, so he couldn't come to office today. Sends you his apologies. So, over to you, Pradeep. Maybe we can have you speaking for around 30 minutes and then we can have a discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amitendu. Thank you very much, and a very good afternoon to all of you. I'm very pleased to be here to speak on a subject on which, as Amitendu introduced me, been engaged since long. In fact, our first foray into understanding about the World Trade Organization, or at that point of time it was not called World Trade Organization, in 1991, when the Uruguay round of the WTO, or the Uruguay round of the GATT was at its peak. And that is when we started wondering, what is this new beast which is going to come, and so on. And as it happens in international meeting of consumer organizations, many of us from the South were looking at it with awe and, with sort of gaping mouth, what is this new animal going to be? And these people are talking about agriculture trade and so on. And that is the time when we realized that this is going to happen. It's a new phase of globalization, or the vehicle for globalization, WTO. And we must understand it in the context of what it means for the developing South. And once again, realizing very well that there is no homogeneity about the developing South. It could vary from size of the country, interest of the country, and so on and so forth. But as Amitendu asked me to speak about, and let me start with South Asia to begin with, before I revert back to the multilateral level. There are various cooperation scenarios that have evolved in South Asia, and their relevance, importance, and implications in the present geopolitical setup of the region. Let me begin by providing a historical evolution of the term South Asia, which was coined by Pentagon in the late 1950s. Given the fact that it replaced the Indian subcontinent, as it was called, which was politically relevant for centuries, India was never comfortable with this new term. Consequently, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation was formed in the year 1985, with its genesis tracked back to an idea on regional cooperation mooted in 1978 by the then President of Bangladesh, General Ziaur Rahman. Due to several geopolitical conflicts that had engulfed in those days in its bordering areas in the west, south, east, and northeast, India was not very comfortable or positive about the formation of SAARC. Given the size and geopolitical setup of India in the South Asian context, this move was speculated to be a conspiracy to harm India in order to reduce its impact on the regional level politics of cooperation. Moreover, India's former Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, was highly skeptical in forging multilateral relations with country-specific leaders in the neighborhood. However, following the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi and due to various global political pressures, India had to accept to the demands of global political powers to entering into a regional cooperation framework called the SAARC. Since its establishment in 1985, SAARC has not made much progress in any areas of regional cooperation. This is evident from successive SAARC summit declarations. For example, the language on food security in summit declarations remained more or less the same, and of course without any concrete progress to achieve its objectives. This is mainly because it requires consensus among all the 8 countries of SAARC to enter into any form of regional cooperative initiative. In the area of trade and economic cooperation, while the SAARC Preferential Trade Agreement arrangement, SAPTA, was established in the early 1990s, and subsequently in 2005, there was an agreement to form the South Asia Free Trade Area. Even after taking into account structural difficulties of smaller economies such as Afghanistan, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, these initiatives have not resulted in much progress in respect to the enhancement of inter-regional trade. For example, under the SAFTA framework, little progress has been made in areas such as trade in services and investment. The non-progress at the SAARC platform is mainly attributed to the ongoing political and military hostility between India and Pakistan. And that's the reason why consensus remains elusive. As a result, and given India's aspiration of enhanced cooperation with its neighboring countries, particularly those in the East, through its Look/East Act East policy, a point of inflection came at the 2014 SAARC summit in Kathmandu. At this summit, 2 specific initiatives of cross-border cooperation were to be announced on energy cooperation and on multimodal connectivity. Due to Pakistan's last-minute reluctance and sheer neglect in achieving consensus towards these initiatives, only one of them, on cross-border energy cooperation, was announced, and that too as a face-saving device. Since then, there is no progress in achieving the objectives of this initiative. Given this development and India's desire to get out of the quagmire of the present condition of regional cooperation in its neighborhood, India, along with 3 other SAARC countries, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal, decided to enter into a sub-regional cooperation initiative on cross-border movement of motor vehicles, as was alluded to by Amitendu in his opening remarks, what we call BBIN. And there is a BBIN motor vehicles agreement, which is progressing pretty fast. Following that, protocols on cross-border movement of both cargo and passenger vehicles have been finalized, and in this summer, once the agreement is ratified by the Bhutanese parliament, its implementation will start. There have been trial runs in any case. The Bangladeshi truck has reached Delhi also as a part of the trial run itself. It is now expected that the BBIN group of countries will take their cooperation forward to areas such as multimodal connectivity, including railways and inland waterways, cross-border electricity trade, and other areas of energy cooperation and digital connectivity. Several bilateral initiatives are already there in many of these new areas of cooperation, which are intrinsically linked with the development challenges that these countries are facing. Following the success of this cooperation initiative among the BBIN group of countries, India and other countries of the Bay of Bengal region have decided to put more and more political and negotiating capital to revive the Bay of Bengal initiative on multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation, which is more popular by its acronym called BIMSTEC. Established in 1997, BIMSTEC is a group of 7 countries in the Bay of Bengal region, 4 BBIN countries plus Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. 4 out of these countries are least developed. Since its establishment, BIMSTEC has not made much progress. One possible reason for this non-progress could be the slowness in concluding a BIMSTEC free trade area. Given the low level and composition of trade among these countries, a BIMSTEC FTA was a non-starter. It is all but shelved. However, following the establishment of the BIMSTEC Secretariat in Dhaka in 2012, this group of countries has realized that they should forge cooperation in areas other than trade. And as a result of specific cooperation initiatives, there will be a boost towards inter-regional trade and investment. Thus, at the recently held BIMSTEC senior officers meeting in Kathmandu, it was decided that the group will focus on two areas of cooperation: security and connectivity, so that people on the ground can realize their benefits and relate themselves with virtues of regional cooperation. Therefore, keeping in mind the framework of the BBI and Motor Vehicles Agreement, at the BIMSTEC summit to be held in Kathmandu later this year, the group is expected to announce the commencement of negotiations for a multimodal connectivity initiative. Another positive development that BIMSTEC has underplayed the term consensus. Instead of taking consensus-based initiative, the BIMSTEC group of countries has decided to follow the Greater Mekong sub-region and the ASEAN models of cooperation. This means that in the absence of consensus and without getting into voting, in effect, if any two countries of the group decide to initiate a cooperation initiative in any area coming under the remit of BIMSTEC, such an initiative will have the support of the BIMSTEC Secretariat, and later on their geographic scope can be expanded. With both Myanmar and Thailand being part of the GMS as well as ASEAN and benefited hugely from various cooperation initiatives with their neighboring countries, they can bring that experience to the BIMSTEC platform, which will provide further political support toward the virtues of regional cooperation. This is because of the success of various sector-specific initiatives that the BIMSTEC countries are having among themselves. For example, the hydropower initiatives between India and Bhutan and India and Nepal, and the keenness of Bangladesh to harness such initiatives through cross-border electricity trade. Similarly, India has port development initiatives in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, which can be beneficial to the other BIMSTEC countries. In short, the objectives and functioning of BIMSTEC is well aligned with India's Act East policy and the Look West policy of Myanmar and Thailand. So there is a complementarity there. Other countries of the region have also realized the potential that it can bring to their growth and development. While giving its location as well as ongoing and future connectivity initiatives, Bangladesh is set to play a pivotal role in connectivity. Bhutan and Nepal have realized that as against landlocked, they can become land-linked and can convert the topography from being a curse to a virtuous circle of development. Now the questions are, will this lead to greater intra-regional trade and investment among the BIMSTEC countries? And B, to be reflected in their possible cooperation at the multilateral level. Given the current state of trade and connectivity among the BIMSTEC countries, if connectivity is improved through various initiatives as mentioned before, and their trade and investment policies are aligned with the objective of establishing regional value chains, there will be definite progress in intra-regional trade and investment. Individually, all of them have started taking steps towards this end. What is needed is a medium to long-term approach towards the establishment of regional value chains through policy and regulatory coherence. And this is a major area. Connectivity initiatives are means towards this end. Coming to the second question, given the kind of socio-economic and environmental challenges that they are facing, there is no other way out but for them to consider both environment and trade as regional public goods. Therefore, it is expected that these countries will cooperate more while negotiating multilateral environmental and trade agreements, such as on climate change and at the WTO. Ultimately, BIMSTEC can become a platform for these countries who are at present not part of the regional comprehensive economic partnership of Asia and the Pacific. Also, in the area of trade and investment, these countries have benefited from many multilateral initiatives such as TRIPS and public health, and various other waivers granted to LDCs by other WTO members. Through various connectivity initiatives and regulatory cooperation, they are expected to gain hugely from the WTO agreement on trade facilitation in goods. Also, the service sector occupies a huge importance in all these countries. They are expected to gain further from trade facilitation in services, which is an idea mooted by India at the WTO. Therefore, and to conclude, this region is one of the poorest in the world, and in some cases, the socio-economic development indicators are even worse than many of those in the sub-Saharan African countries. The BIMSTEC countries have no other option but to harness regional public goods such as environment and trade. Other than cooperation initiatives at the regional level, in order to gain more benefits out of cross-border cooperation, they need to cooperate at the multilateral level. Bodies such as WTO, UNEP, UNFCCC provide such platforms for cooperation. While all of them are part of some coalition or the other in all these bodies, time has come for them to act as a group so that they realize that the sum of parts can indeed be greater than the whole. Now, let me come to the central question which was raised by Amitendu while introducing me in terms of, what could be what is the situation of the WTO as it stands today. As somebody told me, or as it's something which is quite a common cliche, is that what is clearly predictable is that the future is very unpredictable. So we don't know as to what is going to happen to the WTO as such. So the point that we were trying to make in this heading of WTO Reborn was an idea floated by the Chief Economic Advisor of India called Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, that there is a need for middle-level powers to come together in order to ensure that the WTO is able to regain its stature the way it is. Now, particularly in the context, this uncertainty is mostly coming out of the Donald Trump's approach to trade. Things are so uncertain, as I said. One day there is one opinion, second day there is another opinion. Even on trade, he's got 3 or 4 advisors who often don't agree with each other. And there have been reports coming out that ultimately it is the Donald Trump, the president, who is going to prevail rather than Donald Trump, the campaigner, who had many of these things. So how is that going to happen? And therefore what Dr. Subramaniam had suggested was the need for middle-level powers, Nordic countries, Australia, ASEAN countries, etc., have a big responsibility on them in order to buttress WTO at Geneva, in the sense that find one way or the other in order to see to it that it appears meaningful to the world at large rather than less meaningful the way it is. My only concern there is, which is what Trump or one of his advisors had threatened once, that if there is a dispute resolved against the US, they might not even adhere to it. And if that happens, that could become the unraveling of the WTO. Now, we also heard, the TPP has stopped, but at the same time, the countries which are in the TPP minus the US are also talking about, whether we can go ahead with the agreement, provided there is some kind of balancing. So there are many of these, as I said earlier, that what is certainly predictable is there is a lot of unpredictability. And in that, how is it that smaller powers can play their role in whichever arena, whether it is regional or multilateral or bilateral, in order to ensure that the issue of economic relations continues at an even keel rather than be buffeted by unexpected storms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you. I think you have given us a very large amount of food for thought, and we'll of course have an intensive discussion on many of these themes. But before I ask my colleagues to come in with their respective queries, I had a thought, and this is where I wanted to have your view coming in. You see, this is we are looking at WTO from Southeast Asia, and as we see, Southeast Asia has, to a very large extent, been an example of success in regional economic integration. Maybe not comparable to the EU, but nonetheless, for the last 40 years or so, the ASEAN has held up. And it has worked with APEC and a large number of other regional institutions to take forward an agenda of economic cooperation. And today, after the US withdrawal from the TPP, there is a view coming out from many parts of the world, including the US and Europe as well, that if regional trade has to be taken forward in the way it was done in the 80s and 90s, then the only hope is probably ASEAN. And there is a specific convergence of that sentiment with respect to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is being negotiated by 16 countries, including India. Now, this is where I wanted to have your reaction to something. You see, we are familiar with this multilateralism versus regionalism debate in the world of trade for a very long time. And as economists, we always think that the multilateral WTO solution is the most optimal and effective solution for global trade. But the WTO has had its limitations in terms of functions, in terms of characters, in terms of a large number of ways. Now, I wanted to be provocative in this sense and put this question to you, that the TPP setback provided a shot in the arm to the WTO, and you mentioned the Arvind Subramanian proposal, which is a way of repackaging WTO. But supposing if the RCEP succeeds, does it mean again that regionalism revives and WTO is relegated to the background? Because we don't really see the major powers of the world. I mean, US, of course, we know what's going on with the US, but even the EU is not sounding extremely positive about taking the WTO forward. I mean, China also is talking about global trade, championing free trade, but China is not really putting it through the WTO box. And within the WTO, the conversations are not converging. Because you mentioned about this very important trade facilitation agreement in services. There's a great deal of division even within the developing countries on this. So where do you think all this is going to lead to? I mean, I can think of the region coming to, when I say the region, Southeast Asia, in this part of the world, being more enthusiastic about an agenda of regional economic cooperation as opposed to multilateral economic cooperation. So how do you see the WTO, quandary shaping in that context? If you want, you can answer this now or later. Would you prefer us collecting some questions?
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, Deepargo.
Just for clarification from your talk, I felt that it was more about regional integration, and I found a disconnect between the WTO Reborn kind of argument. Now, I'm a bit confused on that, so I would think if you could elucidate a bit more, because the region of South Asia has typically very low levels of trade compared to global trade all around. So by facilitating regional trade integration and maybe connectivity with ASEAN, how are we visualizing a greater bounce back of the WTO, if I could say so? You could elucidate on that.
Your name?
Deepargo.
Deepargo. Okay, I see Shojin here. I see Ankush. Shojin.
I just read a short article about the emergence of the PBIN because I was quite unfamiliar with the concept, and I was wondering whether there was any particular reason why India didn't invite Sri Lanka in that dialogue. Well, initially I thought the article said that initially India approached it with other SAARC countries about this motor vehicle agreement in the SAARC meeting, right? So I guess Sri Lanka must be the part of the dialogue. But was there any political or particular reason why India didn't approach Sri Lanka in this EBI?
Ankush.
Thank you. My name is Ankush. I'm an intern here. I think my question is related to this Bloomberg article that came out recently, which actually said that India is in a way losing faith in free trade. And it pointed out that India's experience, particularly with the Southeast Asian FTA, has severely dented its view of the benefits of free trade. So I would just like to ask if you could give your comments on the reality of the situation, and should that sentiment in India be concretized, what role do you think that would play in the regional and multilateral forum, as being that India is such an important, probably the most important part of the South Asian region. If India is following that line of thought, how would that affect the resurgence of the WTO or even the regional forum?
Any further questions in this round? Or we can always come back. Pradeep?
Let me start with some of the points which Amitendu made. I don't think that if RCEP succeeds, and at the moment I think by and large, including India, in spite of its recalcitrance on some issues, that it is going to affect the multilateral arena. In fact, I would expect that it will give a little boost to the multilateral. This is my sense of things. Now, it has been argued by many since the WTO came into being that, particularly Jagdish Bhagwati talking about a spaghetti bowl of FPTAs, FTAs, whatever is happening. But even between 1995 and WTO came into being to 2005, 200 FTAs were signed. So it's not. Now the argument that, including which I had with Jagdish, was that when you have a contiguous region FTA, it makes sense. So I can agree, but then to have an agreement like TPP doesn't make that kind of. According to Jagdish, contiguous helps, like whether it's ASEAN or SAARC or Mercosur or what have you. It has a lot of peace dividends, which is what we have seen in ASEAN. Unfortunately, we could not see it in South Asia. But that besides, now as far as EU not being confident, Amitendu, if EU itself is now facing issues of Brexit.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of confusion. One of the latest confusion that EU has is that, a very interesting process-related confusion, that Britain remains a member of EU for 2 years until, the divorce actually comes into being. So will it be allowed to sit in the Trade Policy Committee? That's a big dilemma. Because if Britain continues to sit in the Trade Policy Committee, it will know all the insights of how EU is going to take its approach towards trade policy in future, and then use that for its own divorce settlement. And this is a very serious matter. So I don't know how they're going to deal with it. They haven't yet come out with any solution. The point what I'm trying to make, Amitendu, is EU itself is caught in that kind of Brexit warp in terms of its own approach to WTO, but it is not towing the line of US either.
Right.
And in spite of the fact is that even on NATO, which is not a related issue, but somehow or the other these geopolitical issues get entangled with the geo-economic agenda. The US said that, look, why should we be funding NATO? It's your own babe for your defense, so you find money for it. Now they have come back. So that's what I said. The greatest predictability is the unpredictability that we are faced with, and a kind of changing norms coming from the US, and you cannot ignore whatever US does or thinks in any area, geoeconomics particularly. Now, Deepak, your issue about WTO Reborn was an issue in the context of regional cooperation. There is a positivity which evolves. If there is negativity, then nothing else moves, nothing else can. When you are looking at an agenda with, like RCEP also, for example, why I said that it will help multilateralism, because I personally believe, unlike Jagdish Bhagwati or whoever, that regionalism helps these are building blocks rather than stumbling blocks, as has been said by some. It builds positivity towards, do you agree with that? Yeah. So, so if that kind of thing happens, then it gives a signal to the world that, look, we can talk to each other through proper deals on trade. So it becomes a counter to the kind of anti-globalization agenda which is emerging in through Trump and Brexit and Le Pen, I hope, God knows, I think the Dutch elections turned out to be more in favor of the existing world order rather than to go back to protectionism and so on. So we don't know. I mean, everybody is looking out for the French elections as something which would be very important in the sense that how is Europe going to see its future? So Europe itself is passing through a very difficult phase, turbulent phase. Italy they could get over with. Holland they could get over with in the sense that there was no reverses. But if the France election goes in the way as it is, there is hardly 1% difference in the opinion polls between Le Pen and her next challenger, the socialist. Socialist. What's his name? Macron. Or whatever his name is. Be that. I mean, there's a very 1% lead, very slim lead between Le Pen, who could be a very big problem. So therefore, goes back to the question of the kind of things what is happening. And on the other hand, see, the WTO has deliberative functions. And so it is not as if the ministerial is not going to take place. The last two ministerials took place and there was always some positive outcome. India was not happy with what happened in Nairobi because we couldn't get that kind of agreement on the Doha agenda. I personally argued that, look, the Doha agenda is dead, so stop flogging a dead horse here and let's move on with whatever we think we can get out of. So India could get that food security kind of thing, which again, still remains a little uncertain, but there is a certainty about that. Now, so your question about BBI not inviting Sri Lanka, I'm not very sure about that. There has been a discussion, but a very low-key discussion, and they would bring in Sri Lanka through the BIMSTEC agreement. That is what they realized. The other thing which is puzzling India is Afghanistan. And I mean, because it's the other side, and Afghanistan is a very closely allied country with India, and therefore it is also. Then, of course, this issue about Iran and the international North-South trade corridor, INSTC, etc. So there are a lot of things happening on this side, but at a much lesser speed than what is happening towards Eastern India and east of Eastern India. Things are moving here much more faster, and as per the Act East policy of the government of India as such. But Sri Lanka will come on board in one manner or the other, through BIMSTEC, I suspect. And now, Ankush, you are right that in terms of trade policy, there is a general skepticism in the Indian political establishment. This is in spite of what Arvind Subramaniam might be standing out, alone and doing. Otherwise, my personal experience with a very large number of leaders and politicians, including opinion makers, has been that there is a lot of skepticism. Now, it has happened because we've lost in many of the FTAs. I mean, our industry is losing, and I would say to quite a substantial extent, the Indian industry is also responsible. They don't even bother to find out, what is happening, and this is what we have seen in many cases. The customs authority often also get puzzled whether it is to apply the FTA tariffs or to apply the WTO tariffs on any import, for example. I mean, these kind of issues continue to bother us, but on RCEP there is a political understanding that we must go ahead with it, as against this not happening, because in any case, in many ways, RCEP is also a low ambition agenda on many of these things, so which we can live with. The only problem which India has with most of the multilateral or bilateral trade relations is to get mobility of labor, and that is something which is not as easy, which is what is also happening with the Indian proposal at the WTO on trade facilitation and services. What we are saying is we are not talking about market access. What we are talking about is procedural, delays which happen in terms of the permits, etc., should be sorted out. There should be a commitment as you did in goods. But India was too late to come out with this kind of proposal. We should have done it 15 years ago. And let me confess to you, this is something which I had suggested 15 years ago to Government of India. I said, look, we should have seek in a different format rather than the trade facilitation format, but in different format. That why do you want to continue to harp on mode 4 of the services agreement? You ask for a standalone agreement on mobility of labor. As was at that point of time, there was a demand on a standalone agreement on investments. I said, this is what you should, and don't harp on it as part of the services deal, because you can have standalone movement of labor without relationship with mode 3 or what have you. And in that, of course, we had all these issues, including issues of socialization, which is a major problem in terms of socialization is by and large social security benefits being deducted on imported workers, and they are not being able to claim refund of it. It remains in the country. In US, Indian workers must have few billions of dollars lying there, which they can't even lay their hands on. Thank you.
Yeah, another round, please. Do introduce yourself.
My name is Priela from UNI. Of course, my question is related to trade, but not directly related to WTO. I mean, when it comes to trade, I mean the trade settlements. I mean, invariably, whether it's in ASEAN or SAARC, most of the trade settlements take place elsewhere. Say, because we are bound by one a payment and settlement system, I mean, which has to be settled via New York bank accounts. Now, it appears with the election of Donald Trump that he is not very much interested of trade or the relations with other countries. Now, many other countries have been losing trade as a result of exchange rate risk and interest rate risk. And we have been forced to trust on markets, and we know how markets have performed. So whether the countries in this region should have its own payment and settlement system in settling into trade. Now, I'm not proposing that we should have one currency like in the euro areas, but with the technology around us, and we have almost computing power to go back to so many years, or we can project for future, whether the countries in the region, for sake of getting the right deal for those trades that is taking place between. Now, for instance, if you take from Tokyo to Shanghai, goods comes within 4 hours. Payment comes after 3 days. And within that 3 days, many things can happen. Because we are dependent on one universal payment and settlement system. So whether the countries, now the trade volume is getting enlarged in the region, and most of them are inter-regional with the, so whether we should think of a settlement system for trade and many other things within the region. That's my question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to come in? Liana, do you have a question?
India itself. India doesn't have quite a great reputation when it comes to negotiations for trade agreements. So my question is more that India seems to have somehow lost faith in the multilateral trading system, such as the RCEP. It sees it as something that it should definitely be part of, and that's something it can contribute to. But so far it seems to be going more on the bilateral trade agreements. A lot of cooperations with specific countries such as Australia and Malaysia. So can this be considered more effective for India rather than just going through the multilateral or regionalism methods of cooperating with other countries?
What could be more effective? Can you rephrase your question?
Because right now India seems to be focusing more on bilateral cooperations, so would this be seen more effective for India to, in terms of globalization and increasing its reach globally, which can lead in the long term to better agreements and better negotiations? Or is it more effective for it to follow the multilateral system, take part in regional initiatives? Yeah.
I think basically what she's essentially hinting at is that whether bilateral agreements really would serve the objective of India expanding more into, global and regional markets as opposed to the multilateral or regional frameworks. Because if reaching global markets is the objective, then maybe bilateral FTAs are not the right path to follow. I think that's probably what you had on your mind, right? Oh, bilateral agreements might be the way to go. Okay. So in that case, you're more in sync with the Indian policy as opposed to what I thought. Sir, you have a question?
You talked about glorious uncertainties. The issue is just this. On the one hand, you have, in fact, you defined it very well, the EU still in a state of flux, not able to decide whether to include Britain, not to include Britain. And within the EU itself, which way is going to play, labor movements being what they are, that's number one. On the other hand, you have the Trump administration coming in. You just don't know on what issue, what stand they will take. There's total uncertainty over there. Take the issue of China. China will be part of every agreement, but if any issue goes to their disadvantage, they will just not follow it. And they've been saying it very open about it. I mean, at the least they've started flexing their muscles. Then you have the bilateral conglomerates, smaller ones. Now, what kind of a negotiating ploy will these bilaterals or these regional subgroups have? Because when you have these three large groups which are not willing to plug into anything which will be of a permanent kind of a solution going forward. Now, this is actually the best illustration of this was what John Kennedy had said, that it's useless for the sheep to preach vegetarianism when the wolf remains of a different opinion. Now these three blocks are going to be, taking their own decisions whichever way. Now what is the plank on which we are able to negotiate for any of them to our betterment?
Thank you, sir. Pradeep, I wanted to add a final question, thought, whichever way you put at it. And this is to go back to the WTO Reborn idea, the Arvind Subramanian proposal that middle powers coalesce for giving WTO, a new sort of lease of life. Now, I am just wondering that when we talk about middle powers, I mean, these are powers which are not content to remain middle. They would want to become large at some stage. They are probably at this point in time middle. Now, asking them to lead the WTO would assume that they have some commonality in their global trade interests. Is that practical? I mean, when you look at countries like, let's say, Australia, Brazil, China, well, China should be kept out of this. Australia, Brazil, India, Nigeria, for example, Turkey.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of trade commonality in their interests and so on and so forth? So isn't this a bit far-fetched? I mean, I would say probably more romantic than practical. Yeah. Okay, so that's enough for you to munch on.
The question from gentleman from here on trade settlements, I must pardon me my ignorance about these financial issues. I have not dealt with them. What I am aware of is that you do require a kind of a payment system which can be operated uniformly in a particular region. I saw it happening the other day in East Africa, for example. And the East African community has been able to develop something like that, a payment settlement system among all the EAC members. And that can happen in ASEAN also. I don't know whether this exists in ASEAN. I'm not aware. As I said, this is not an area of my work, but I'm so very tertiarily aware of what is happening there. The points which you made are very valid in the sense that the exchange rate and the exchange risk often impact trade volumes adversely. There's no doubt about that. And if a payment and settlement system can be the solution, I'm sure it can be. Now, even if you notice, technology, the way it has been disrupting things, you're looking at bitcoins and you're looking at blockchain. Blockchain itself is going to be a very, very major revolution in the world where everything is now open. The ledger system is no longer that you can, hide behind some opaque doors, whether it's your payment system as well. So I suspect that blockchain would be probably a better universal solution. This I'm talking only through my common sense. These are issues which I have not studied in detail, so don't ask me any further questions on it, except to say that what any of you would have read about it is something which I've also been reading about it. Now, Anna, your question about Indians are not poor negotiators; they are terrible negotiators. To use for several reasons, are they seeing whether bilateral is the way to go? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about any clarity of thinking in the Indian policy establishment, which is what I just said. By talking to several important figures who can matter in trade policy, our minister, for example, she also gives out confusing signals, Nirmala. And even our trade policy bureaucracy, the trade policy division is also a bunch of skeptics who are unwilling to look at anything new. This is a very problem. Our ambassador in the WTO is one of the worst examples, Anjali Prashad. So we do.
This is all under Chatham House rules.
Yeah.
So don't hold yourself back.
Right. No, what I'm saying is that, we do have this kind of problem, but just a little humor. There's this famous European Union and British minister, Edward, what's his name?
I can't recall.
Who is to be Deputy Prime Minister in UK also? In the Labour government? Edward Heath. No, not Edward Heath. There's another person who said very famously, he said it's so difficult to get an Indian negotiator to stop speaking. And more difficult is to get a Chinese negotiator to start speaking. Just to give you a kind of character of kind of thing. But anyway, so your questions are very flummoxing. I mean, this is, as I said, is a part of the entire uncertainty that we are faced with today. Is to how will these three blocks look at future, which goes to the question which Amitendu reiterated about the middle powers. Now, see, the commonality is not trade. The commonality is of the process. That look, we need to respect the process. And
respect it.
Yeah.
Respect it.
And adhere to it. This is this is the point which I'm making. In contrast to the point which you made, that that there is an institution which we have floated, which, by the way, constitutionally has a voting provision, but as a convention, it has been held by members that we will only follow consensus. We will not allow voting to happen. Other voting happens, then you can throw out US any time by the sheer number of the developing countries who are there in the WTO. But it has never happened. Otherwise, things could have been worse if voting was allowed. Now, I said, EU itself is in a flux, in a serious flux at the moment, and US, as we know, is in a different kind of mood. China, as was rightly said by Amitendu, is extremely selfish about, it will only look at its own prospects to bother about anything else, and is also at the same time becoming a global superpower. I mean, let's look at the security side, what's happening in South China Sea, for example, is indicative of how it will behave even in Geneva.
They're saying it very clearly.
They're saying it they'll behave the same way, and they've made it very clear that they were raising serious problems about Dalai Lama's visit to part of territory which China believes to be a part of Tibet, which is ludicrous. But anyway, I mean, what I'm saying is that China is certainly becoming more and more belligerent as we see in times to come. They have, Xi Jinping in Davos had said that, look, spoken in favor of globalization. He went and met Donald Trump, and they seem to have agreed on few things that, yes, China is not a currency manipulator. At least that is the impression we get from the outcome of their meeting.
Davos, he was statesman-like.
Yeah, Davos is a statesman. No, in his meeting with Trump, the recent meeting of a couple of days ago, which came out.
Mar-a-Lago. At Mar-a-Lago,
Mar-a-Lago, the
resort.
yeah, what's it called? The Winter White
Florida,
House.
the winter.
The Winter White House. Like we are the summer capital of Shimla.
But in such a situation, you have to agree. If you negotiated in that kind of a
Right.
resort and its environs, you can't disagree.
So coming back to the point, which is what I had said, was that it is very critical for the processes to be respected, rather than the commonality of trade, but the process. That is what Subramaniam calls that. And I was talking to Chatham House Rules, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, even Harshvardhan Singh didn't agree with it. He says, look, middle powers have always been there, so what is, I personally feel that, there is always an opportunity to, especially when all the chips are down, that is when, you have to look at possible ways as to how to, look at future.
Any further comments, questions? If not, then let me just try to put this into a larger context, Pradeep. I think we are having this conversation in a country and a part of the world which has been very eager on trade, if I can put it that way. I mean, Singapore, of course, as a country has almost a 500% trade GDP ratio, but we are also in the neighborhood of countries who are very outward oriented, and they have been traditionally so. And for many of these countries, today's world and trade prospects is rather gloomy. So there is a certain degree of despondency that has set in this part of the world, which is a combination of various factors. First, a slowdown in China for the last couple of years. Second, the calamitous fate of the TPP, because TPP can be justified as a security alliance led by the US, but it's also supposed to have been a very different kind of trade agreement in a large number of ways. Probably the fact that the US has moved out of the TPP, in a sense, has reduced the threat for WTO, because the liver of global trade governance is not going to shift. It's going to remain with the WTO in whatever punctured form it is. But that doesn't really serve the interests of the region as much, because, for the region, it's a setback. Because it was supposed to have been an accelerating process towards greater economic growth and activity, and create new zones and spaces for trade. I mean, for a country like Vietnam, for example, this was supposed to have been a game changer, even for Malaysia. So now, to that extent, this is a region which has, as you said, been active on regional trade agreements. It goes back to the RCEP, expects the best to come out of it, but I think here there's a degree of cynicism which is occupying the mindsets, and that cynicism comes out of the fact, and this is where unfortunately I think WTO is also being looked at as a framework which may not be able to pull many countries and the region out of this despondency. Is that the trade discourse is happening in very contrasting voices. Now, if we look at protectionism and the consensus against it, it's coming out of WTO and IMF. But no country is actually talking about containing protectionism. And I think that's a serious issue. That's where there's a certain degree of apprehension in the region that, let's say, for example, China is talking about free trade. China is talking about protectionism not being imposed by developed countries, but that doesn't necessarily mean that China itself is going to walk back on the degree of protectionism that it has maintained in certain spheres of trade with itself. You know, non-tariff barriers, quality standards, labor movement, so on and so forth. So there is a concern, because I think this region understands it very clearly that if countries like US and China, which are the bigger powers, they back off from trade in an individualistic fashion, that's not good for them. That's not good for this part of the world. And this is where I think this middle power, story has not been cutting too much of ice in this region. I think there's a certain degree of lack of conviction as to it. I mean, you are headed to Australia, and I think you will find this resonating over there. I think there is say for example, the TPP, can it run as a TPP 11? Australia proposed that China be brought into the TPP 11. Japan said, no way. So, I mean, there's a huge degree of divergence even among middle powers as to how they should handle the other countries if they are to take a trade agreement forward. So, on that note and on that context, I think as academics and students of international trade, today we are looking at a fairly complicated prospect for global trade. And I think it's connected to a large number of issues where I'm not too sure if the WTO is actually capable of handling these things, because there are issues emerging, like, say, for example, electronic commerce, trade facilitation in services, not to talk about the quintessential labor mobility issue. So I'm not too sure if the WTO is actually equipped to handle this. Maybe the time has come to think whether the WTO can first take itself forward to a level which can be, close to the aspirations of a large number of countries of the world in their own diverse form. And maybe on that we can engage in more conversation and more issues. We have a fairly active trade program at ISAS. We are happy to work with cuts and combine on a large number of other issues to take this forward. So on that note, Pradeep, thank you very much for visiting us, sharing your thoughts with us. We have had a very active 1 hour and 5 minutes of conversation, which I think we can continue over tea and coffee. On behalf of ISAS, my pleasure to share this report with you. It's a report on India-Singapore trade and investment, which we did from ISAS as part of a study that we did for the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And I think a request from the ISAS community to be passed on to you is that if the thoughts that you shared with us, if you could share with us further,
I'll email it to you.
Yeah, then we can think of taking this forward into a document, a proper document which can be archived and put up on our website.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
It's not done, but let me just reflect on the last point that you made, whether WTO is competent or not. Do we have an option?
No, that's also true.
We don't have an option.
We are between the devil and the deep sea.
No,
so
we have to stop thinking like this. I mean, I'm not being skeptical or cynical, but then we cannot. We have to stop thinking that this is the only body that has to be.
In fact, this is why, Pradeep, I think you made a very important point when you mentioned the US in the beginning today. I think the biggest threat for an organization like the WTO is if national laws start becoming supreme to the multilateral law. I mean, when it comes to disputes, and if countries lose out and a country refuses to change its policies to the WTO ruling, I mean, today the US has put it very clearly in its trade policy agenda. China always did that without mentioning so. And there's actually no reason why a country like India would hesitate to, push its national law before the WTO law. I mean, it's after all sovereign rulemaking. So I think that's where this, forgive me for being cynical, but I think this middle power is a bit of a romantic idea. We can discuss this more in detail.
If any of you have gone through the history of the Havana Charter in 1948,
no,
it was the same US intransigence. It said, look, our sovereignty is going to get, Going to Geneva, no way.
But having said that, we don't have a better alternative also. That's also
No,
true.
we don't have an option.
We don't have an option.
I think that is what I would like to leave a thought.
Yes,
so that
yes.
you
So-
you have to make the best out of what there is. There is no other alternative.
So even if WTO is not reborn, let it stay alive. If not in ventilation, let it stay alive. Thank you, Pradeep. Come,
Thank
let's
you.
have coffee. Thank you.